Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Tom.
Hi, I'm Stephanie.
Today, we're going to continue talking about the curious case of Q. And I'm sure last time we probably made you hungry when we talked about it. And right after you listened to our lesson, you probably ran out to the nearest night market.
Of course.
And got something QQE. QQE. I'm trying to switch over to the English way of saying it. Even though foreigners in America, Canada, England would not say it that way. They'd probably say chewy. Or what else did we have? We had bouncy, and we had springy.
Yeah.
Springy, which is kind of hard to say. But those are kind of words you can use to describe something that is QE.
Yeah, it's definitely an Asian word, I have to say, because if you use this word or this letter to describe a texture of food outside of the Asian area, I don't think people will know what you're talking about. They would look at you kind of funny and going, what? Q, what? So it's best if you learn what that Q texture, how it can be described in English, so that when you explain this to your foreign friends, they'll know what you're saying. They'll know what you're talking about. Of course, Tom and I have been here forever, and so we know what Q is. And some of the foods that are described as being QQ. So we're going to go ahead today, read day 2, and then we'll be back to talk more about the curious case of Q.
The texture of Q is not unknown in the West. Q foods are pillars of the dessert course in many countries outside Asia. However, these jellies and gummies are almost universally sweet, so savory Q dishes are unfamiliar to most Westerners. Reasons for this abound. In many European cuisines, as well as the North and South American traditions they inspired, flavors are essential while textures are secondary. A food's texture will probably be described as either tender or smooth if it's mentioned at all. The words that come closest to describing Q are not pleasing to the Western ear. They might even provoke disgust. Crunchy boiled shrimp? Chewy or rubbery meat? These convey the speaker's judgment of insufficient skill on the part of the cook. Chewy meat might be undercooked or overcooked. If boiled shrimp are crunchy, it must be because the incompetent cook forgot to remove their shells before adding them to the dish. In the East, though, Q food proclaims the cook's dedication to the hard work that yields such rich textures. To make fish meatballs, for example, fish scraps must be ground and beaten with the flat of the cook's blade against the cutting board until enough air has been blended into the meat. Through this process, they become tasty, bouncy little balls. With such techniques, delicacies can be produced from humble ingredients like leftover chunks of fish or plain, simple rice. As sweet Q foods and drinks gain popularity around the world, though, perhaps people's tastes will broaden to embrace the distinct pleasure of savory Q dishes. Chefs specializing in Asian cuisines think of Q as a tool to deliver more complex flavors. After all, as one chef says, the food is literally sitting on your palate longer.
Okay, guys, let's dive in. The texture of Q is not unknown in the West. Notice we kind of have a double negative here. Unknown, not unknown means known. So the texture of Q is known in the West. We just don't call it Q. We have that texture, is what we're trying to tell you, but nobody has ever described that particular texture as Q. So Q foods are pillars of the dessert course in many countries outside Asia. So where might you run into these foods that have that QQ-like texture in the West? Usually if you're eating a type of dessert. Now, when you are describing something as being a pillar of something else, you're saying it's something that is very important to that thing. When I was growing up, I would read books, and they'd always describe these very respectful or respected people of the community. They'd call them pillars of the community, that they were important to that particular community. People could trust them. So a pillar is just like a big a pole or a post. That's something that holds something else up. So we're calling it some of the pillars of the dessert course. Some of the most important dessert dishes in countries outside Asia have that QQ texture.
Right, they're pillars of the dessert course. They are the foundation, they're the bases, etc. You've got to have it in some dessert course or courses. Remember, in Western countries and probably other places, they have their meals in courses. And I'm not too familiar with this. I'm American. We have basically 3 courses, I think. First is a salad, then is the main dish, and then is dessert. That's 3 courses there. But in European countries, they have more courses than that. But in any case, it's just a section of the meal, and dessert, the sweet thing you eat after your meal, is the dessert course. However, these jellies and gummies are almost universally sweet, so savory Q dishes are unfamiliar to most Westerners. Reasons for this abound. So indeed, you will find Q food in Western cuisine, but it's mostly in desserts, and the desserts can be jellies or they can be gummies. Jelly is kind of like food that's kind of wiggly, I guess. Kind of like xiancao here in Taiwan.
Yeah.
It's similar to that. It's not hard, it's not soft, it's just kind of jiggly. I guess you could say that. And gummies are a little more chewy than that. I think gummies are sometimes candy, actually.
Yeah, gummy bears.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those are pretty popular. Even here in Taiwan, we have gummy bear type candies that you can buy. There's a different brand. I was looking online last night and it came on my screen. I thought, oh, those are gummy bears. So yeah, they're almost universally sweet, meaning almost always sweet. So savory Q dishes are unfamiliar to most Westerners. If something's savory, it's got more of a salty taste. I would describe, more meat dishes as being savory instead of sweet. So yeah, it's pretty unusual to find savory dishes or main dishes, you could say, with this QQ texture. Reasons for this abound. If something abounds, it just means it's found everywhere. So, and you'll often see it in writing. You could say convenience stores abound in Taiwan. Just large numbers or amounts of something. That's what abound means. So there are lots of reasons for this. Let's go through some of these.
Okay, so let's go to some European countries, or in many European cuisines, as well as the North and South American traditions they inspired. Flavors are essential, while textures are secondary. So in different European cuisines, German cooking, French cooking, etc., and then also we're talking about North and South American traditions, which inspired European cuisines. Of course, they colonized North and South America and brought back some of the ingredients there, and that affected the food in Europe, especially like the tomato, for example. These traditions in European countries and I guess North and South America consider the flavors to be the most important thing, but the textures are secondary. Yeah, it's nice to have interesting textures if something's chewy or crunchy or whatever, but it's the taste that's the most important, at least according to this sentence here.
Yeah, so let's move on here. It says a food's texture will probably be described as either tender or smooth if it's mentioned at all. Yeah, you don't often have the texture of a food described, at least in English. Maybe that's more important here. The words that come closest to describing Q are not pleasing to the Western ear. So they might even provoke or cause people to feel some sort of disgust. Like this, crunchy boiled shrimp. Chewy or rubbery meat. Oh yeah, if your meat is chewy or rubbery, someone cooked it wrong, right? So the first time I had beef noodle soup, I thought, what in the world? Do they not know how to cook, meat here? Because the tendons were not my favorite part, I must say.
You're talking about the tendons, of course, and not the meat itself.
No.
If you have chewy meat, that is bad. So we often use the word rubbery to describe meat that has not been prepared properly. And again, some of these words that describe food's texture will not sound good good to a Western person, you want to find the word tender or smooth, okay? So yes, a food's texture will probably be described as either tender, like a tender steak, for example. It's not too hard, it's not too smooth, not too hard or not too soft. And it might be, they might also use the word smooth to describe something. I know that we often use the word smooth to describe good whiskey. If it's good whiskey, then we say, ooh, that's very smooth. It's very nice whiskey. It goes down smoothly. But it's also used to describe food as well.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking of like a milkshake or soup. Sometimes if you really strain the soup, it's very smooth. It doesn't have little bits of vegetables that you can pick out. So, yeah, we use those. But, wow, that one word in particular just isn't very appetizing, and that's rubbery. If you think about rubber, nobody wants to be eating rubber, usually. It's gross. So these convey or communicate. That's what convey means. The speaker's judgment of insufficient skill on the part of the cook. Yeah, if you were to get rubbery or chewy meat, you'd say, oh, this chef is really bad. Who cooked this? So it would definitely be seen as a failure. So chewy meat might be undercooked or overcooked. Yeah, if you don't cook it enough, then it's definitely hard to chew. But if you've overcooked it, it's worse. So if boiled shrimp are crunchy, it must be because the incompetent cook forgot to remove the shells before adding them to the dish. I know that's kind of popular here to leave the shells on because then you suck the shell of the shrimp, and there's a lot of juice in that. The first time I ate shrimp cooked like that in Taiwan, I was horrified. I looked at my friend, and I didn't have much Chinese then, and I just kept pointing my chopstick at the shrimp saying, toe, because the head was still on it.
All right.
And I thought, oh my gosh, someone didn't take the head off the shrimp. Well, of course, if you leave the whole shell on, then you can suck the juices out better. So it's just different styles. Incompetent, what does that mean, Tom?
It means you're not qualified for your job. This can happen a lot with politicians. A politician may be running for office or re-election, and people will say, don't vote for him or her because they are incompetent. They're not qualified. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have the qualifications to do the job. They should be doing something else, like driving a taxi or something like that. And yes, indeed, we may think that, where the heck did they get this cook to cook a steak like that?
Yeah.
Yes, we did describe a steak as being chewy, but it also could be tough. If a steak is too hard or has been overcooked, sometimes we describe it as being tough.
Right.
It's hard to chew, and you probably can't swallow it because it's just so tough.
And the opposite, of course, is what was mentioned earlier, tender. Everyone wants to have a tender piece of meat, especially beef.
Absolutely. Okay, that brings us to the midway point in our explanation for today. Let's turn things over now to our Chinese teacher.
听众朋友大家好，我是安娜。我们昨天特别提到 Q 这种 texture 这种口感，我们就觉得什么东西都要 Q 啊，不管是甜的要 Q 啊，咸的也要 Q 啊。好，那这种所谓的 Q 的口感呢，其实在西方也不是说没有啦，也不能说很陌生。不过呢 Q 食其实在亚洲以外许多的甜点啊，这些国家甜点料理通常都会做的比较 Q。所以普遍来说，西方人觉得 Q 的东西大概都是甜的，像是 jellies 果冻啦 gummies 一些软糖。所以如果吃到咸的 QQ 的东西，西方人就觉得好像不太熟悉。我们在第一段当中特别注意一下最后一句最后一个字，那中间的原因是有很多的。为什么西方人会觉得咸的 Q 的东西好像怪怪的呢？为什么不熟悉呢？原因有很多。其实我们看到有很多，这个有我们就会觉得是 have 或者是 there 加 be 动词。其实在英文当中有很多有一个字很好用诶，叫做 abound。abound 就有富含有很多，所以原因有很多，你可以说 reasons abound， 原因有很多，所以这个有很多大家可以学起来，好用。好，那为什么会这样子呢？第一个原因是这样子的，也就是说，其实有很多欧洲美食跟他们所启发的一些北美或南美的饮食传统当中，这种 flavors 味道很重要，但是 textures 口感是比较其次的东西。 第二段的第一句就在讲这个。首先注意逗点之后的 as well as， 它是个连接词，就是 and 的概念。不过 as well as 之后到逗点之前带了一个关带省略的限定用法关系子句。先行词是 the North and South American traditions， 那么关系子句只有 they inspired， 关带省略的就是 which 或者是 that。 为什么可以省略呢？我们昨天有说过，因为 which 或 that 这个关带如果在括号里面作为自己关系子句的受词，它就可以省略。在这里作为什么受词呢？就是 inspire， 激励激发这个动作的受词，所以它可以不写。不过句子因为有点长，后面还出现逗点的 while， 这里的 while 是个连接词，不过它不表时间，它表示是一种相反相对的概念。然而口感则是一个比较其次的东西。好，也就是说 Q 如果在西方真的是提到的话呢，Q 大概不会用啦，他们大部分会用 tender 软嫩啊，或者是 smooth 比较滑顺这类的这样的字眼。比较接近 Q 的话呢，那西方人会觉得好像不太好吃哦。比如说水煮虾很 Q， 或者是这个肉呢很 Q， 那这样子西方人听起来觉得好像这个厨艺不足诶，因为他们会觉得肉如果有 QQ 嚼劲的话，可能是 undercooked， 没煮熟，要不然就是 overcooked， 煮了太熟。这两个关键字出现在第二段第5句的地方，我们可以学起来。没煮熟 undercooked， 煮得太熟 overcooked。 所以如果煮熟的虾 QQ 很脆，那一定是不称职的厨师在煮饭之前这个煮菜之前忘记剥虾壳咯。
We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, guys. We're talking about the curious case of Q. And we started off by telling you that the texture itself of Q is known in the West. It's not unknown. People are familiar with the texture. We just don't call it Q. So Q foods are pillars or important parts of the dessert course in many countries outside Asia. In the West, for example. But we've got jellies and gummies. They're always sweet. But if it's savory, something you'd have for an appetizer or maybe a main dish, savory Q dishes are very weird. You don't see those in most Western countries. Reasons for this abound. So there are many reasons why this is true. In many cuisines in Europe, as well as the North and South American traditions they inspired, flavors are essential. It has to have a good flavor. While textures aren't quite as important, the flavor is numero uno, or number one, and that's what they focus on for the most part.
Exactly. So again, in the East, Q food proclaims the cook's dedication to the hard work that yields or produces such rich textures. Okay, so indeed, a cook here has to be dedicated to the hard work of making food. You want the cook to be professional in what they're doing. They cannot be incompetent. They have to be competent. They have to be trained. They have to be skilled. And they have this dedication to that hard work. Dedication just refers to your attitude of not giving up on something. You're going to keep working hard until you get it right, and you want to improve all the time. And dedicated is the adjective. You could say you're dedicated to your job. You want to do a good job. You're not just doing it for the money. You want to be professional and all that stuff. And also in this sentence, we have the word proclaim, which means you state something to be true, and you want that to be the case here. So yes, indeed, Q food proclaims or claims or tells us about the cook's dedication to that hard work. And if they have that dedication, then they will produce those rich textures. Otherwise, no one will want to eat what they produce.
So true. So here's an example. To make fish meatballs, what do you need to do? Well, you take fish scraps and then you grind them. They must be ground. You grind them and beat them with the flat of a cook's blade against the cutting board until enough air has been blended into the meat. Now, I didn't know that. That's so interesting. That's how they get them to be a little bit lighter. Scraps are what we call the remains of something after we've used the best part or the better part of something. When Mom would cook dinner, she would often take the scraps of the meat that we didn't want to eat. A lot of it was fat, gristle. That would be the rubbery, tendon-like parts that we don't like in America. She would give them to our dog, Mav. And he would love them. So your scraps. Now, if you go to the restaurant, you're not going to say to the waiter or the waitress, hey, will you get a box for me? I want to put my scraps in the box. Scraps sounds like stuff you want to throw out. So use leftovers. That's a nicer word than scraps. But we do have scraps. Maybe if you're sewing a dress, guys, and you have extra material left over, you take those scraps and you might make a cute quilt out of them later on.
It is possible, indeed. So the fish is probably used for other purposes to make fish fillet or something.
Yeah.
So they have leftover fish, pieces of fish that they don't use in other dishes. So they're the fish scraps. And they're ground, which means they're made into smaller portions like you do with coffee. You'll grind coffee before you prepare a cup of coffee. And, of course, the past tense and the past participle of to grind is ground. So they will be ground and they will be beaten with the flat of the cook's blade. Wham, wham, wham. They'll hit the fish there on a cutting board. And they're doing this until enough air has been blended into the meat. It's a process here. And through this process, they become tasty. Those fish scraps become tasty, bouncy little balls. So that's how they make fish meatballs.
I like those.
Which, of course, are considered chewy and they have that QQ texture.
Yeah, I wanted to note here, sometimes we just call them fish balls. We don't call them fish meatballs. Just fish balls is good.
Now, with such techniques, delicacies can be produced from humble ingredients like leftover chunks of fish or plain simple rice. A delicacy, of course, is a kind of food that is exquisitely prepared. It's not just a boring old hamburger or something like that. It's a fine food and it requires chefs to prepare. It takes probably a lot of time to prepare it. And, of course, they will appear on TV shows that talk about such kinds of foods. You're not going to be talking about deep-fried French fries on a cooking show because they're just not delicacies.
Yeah, they're pretty commonplace. So you've got delicacies that can be produced from humble ingredients or, relatively inexpensive ingredients like leftover chunks of fish or plain simple rice. So a chunk of something is usually kind of a thick, solid piece of something. Maybe you've had some chunks of meat or chunks of vegetables show up in your soup when you thought you had strained it so it would be smooth, but you get it. I like chunks of vegetables, though, in my soup. So moving on to the final paragraph, as sweet Q foods and drinks gain popularity around the world, though, people's tastes will broaden or expand to embrace the distinct pleasure of savory Q dishes. Yeah, everybody has, not everybody, but a lot of people have the chance to travel abroad. So you get to experience other cultures' foods, their cuisines. And so you're introduced to things you hadn't tasted before or tried before. And that can broaden your horizon, broaden your horizons. So you just get to, experience other cultures and you might find you like what they have. Broaden just means to expand.
Right, so we're talking about Westerners kind of getting used to Q foods that aren't sweet, that are savory. So, yes, indeed, their taste will broaden and they'll enjoy and embrace those distinct dishes that are described as Q. And chefs specializing in Asian cuisines think of Q as a tool to deliver more complex flavors. Remember, chefs like doctors will specialize in certain areas. There are chefs who specialize in cooking Asian cuisines like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, etc., etc. And they think of Q as a tool to deliver those more complex flavors. It's just one way to make a dish more flavorful, you can use crunchy or soft or Q.
Right. So after all, as one chef says, the food is literally sitting on your palate longer. Literally means exactly what we just said. So if it's literally sitting on your palate longer, it's right there in your mouth, on your tongue, where all your taste buds are. And so you get a bigger sense of the flavor because of the texture cue. And it's just sitting in your mouth longer as you try to chew it because it's a little chewy or a little bit softer, a little bit bouncy. So remember that the next time you get a chance to try something that is very QQ. Right now, we're going to listen one more time to our Chinese teacher.
可是在东方就不一样啦，我们如果说为了要让鱼丸 Q 要让贡丸 Q， 这个是要很费工的，所以东方料理当中 Q 是显示厨师为了制作这种口感努力的付出，在第3段第1句就在谈这个概念。不过它有一个限定用法关系子句，先行词是中间后面 the hard work。限定用法关系子句从 that 一直到句尾的地方，这括号中间的 yield 是动词哦，也就是让啊、付出啊这样子的意思。好，所以其实东西会 Q 的话，就表示这个厨师一定有很多的 hard work。就像我们刚刚讲的，贡丸、鱼丸要 Q， 鱼肉先捣碎，然后用刀背呢打，把这个空气混进去，然后整坨肉呢要在这个容器里面一直打才会 Q， 所以经过这整套流程的话，整个食物才会变成有所谓的弹性，才会好吃。而且有这种技术，剩下的鱼块啊，或者是什么白米饭啊，这些不起眼的食材，就可以用来制作很 Q 的美食佳肴。同样在第3段第3句跟第4句的地方，我们注意2个介系词哦。第3句第一个字的 through 透过这个过程介系词，透过某种方法。同样第3段第4句 with such techniques， 这里的 with 就是使用的意思，或者是表原因也可以。使用这样的技术，就因为有这种技术，所以我们才可以做出很 Q 的东西，好吃的东西。不过因为 Q 的甜食跟饮料就风靡全球啦，所以其实西方人可能会慢慢对于 Q 料理会觉得蛮有趣的。那像是这些专门制作亚洲料理的大厨啊，他们其实会把 Q 呈现更复杂风味的时候呢，他们会觉得这个是一个很重要的一个手段。就像有一个厨师曾经说啊，食物其实实际上真的停留在你的味蕾的时间是更长的时间。我们在第4段当中，请特别注意一下 as 这个字。as 在英文当中啊，如果是介系词，它可能有作为什么样身份的意思，后面直接加上一个身份或职称。比如说 be famous as 因什么身份而出名。可是在第4段当中第1句的 as 跟第4段当中第3句的这里的 as， 它们都是连接词哦。as 如果当连接词就是 when because 或者是如同好像，所以在这里我们根据文意推测，第4段的第1句 as 是 when， 当 Q 感的甜食跟饮料风靡全球 when， 第3句的 as 如同好像，如同有一个 chef 主厨曾经说过的 The food is literally 就是字面上，也就是真的，它停留在你的味蕾更久的时间了。所以 Q 这个东西可能会风靡全球，不只是亚洲人，西方人其实也渐渐接受 Q 的东西。以上是我们今天的内容，我们下次见，我是安娜，拜拜。
That's all for today. Thanks for joining us, and please join us again next time for another edition of our program. And enjoy your trip to the night market because I'm sure that we have inspired you to go check out some Q food yourself. From all of us here at English Digest, I'm Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
Goodbye.
Bye.